All right, welcome back. We just talked about UDP and TCP and multicast and unicast. Let's go back to those protocols and let's actually look at what an audio channel is. Let's talk about what it means to send audio across the network and the bandwidth requirements of sending an audio channel from a transmitting device to a receiving device. We know that an audio channel is a unicast point-to-point UDP connection. We know that already. But how much bandwidth does that require? Let's take a look at that. Every single network audio stream, which may have multiple network audio channels within it, could use between 3.31 to 26.41 megabits per second, depending on how many network audio channels are within that stream. We'll take a look at that calculation on the very next slide, and you'll see where those numbers are coming up from. Keep in mind that if you're using a redundant network, Q-SYS generates those audio streams twice and sends them both out in real time completely. So that means that you will ultimately be doubling the amount of bandwidth that you are using, albeit on different ports, but that does not necessarily affect the network audio channel count of your cores, especially on some of the server cores. So just be sure to double check. If you're using redundant networks, check with your core specs to make sure whether or not that will affect your network audio channel count, if that is a concern when you're doing redundant cores, if you may be running out of possible audio channel counts. Now, audio packets must traverse the network in less than 280 microseconds. That's very important. We'll talk about that in just a little bit as well, why speed is so critical for this audio to get across the network. But let's talk a little bit more about the bandwidth that we were just talking about. If you go in Q-SYS Designer software to the top left and you go to the Check Design option in the file menu, then you'll see this screen right here. This is the Check Design tool, and it shows you all sorts of useful information about your design, the number of audio players that you're using, the number of processing power that you're using. But down at the bottom, it tells you your total bandwidth that you are using for your input and output network. Now, this is basically the connection from the core to the switch. Right? This is the amount of bandwidth you're using for that very first connection where the core is sending everything out. If you need to get more granular and figure out exactly what the bandwidth is between two other audio devices on the network, then you're going to have to do that manually by figuring out how many audio channels are being sent from that device to this device, which you can certainly do. And that is done with these calculations here. Every single network audio stream requires 1.77 megabits per second, and every network audio stream can contain within it up to 16 network audio channels. And every single one of the channels is using 1.54 megabits per second. I like to think of this like a bus with passengers in it. Even if there's only one passenger, you do still need the bus to get that passenger from A to B. So you could have a network audio stream with only one network audio channel in it. That is true. Or you could have 16 network audio channels and it's still just one bus. You add that all together and you'll figure out what the bandwidth is for that particular group of audio channels to be sent. So one stream with 16 channels, that's that 26.41 megabits per second that we talked about in the previous slide, whereas one stream with one channel would have been the 3 megabits per second that we showed as the bottommost end of that range. Important to note that your audio streams can use up to 86 to even 90% of your available traffic on the network. We want to leave a little bit of headroom, the same way that you leave a little bit of headroom on your amplifiers, so that if there's, for some reason, a giant spike in network traffic, that we still have that availability. But you really can use the majority of that network just for your audio streams, and you will be all right. And again, just a reminder that you are duplicating that by 2 if you are doing redundant networks. Let's take a little bit of a historical look. Why do we need to send audio so quickly? Why this 280 microseconds requirement? What does it mean to send audio? We say that audio is real time. What does that mean? Well, in Q-SYS, we are using a sample rate of 48K. So we are taking your audio and we're chopping it up into little bits and sending that across the network. And that is sent with a buffer of 16, meaning that audio is processed in batches of 16 samples. That's an audio frame inside Q-SYS. Okay, well, if each buffer or audio frame has 16 samples, and that means we need to send 3,000 packets or samples per second because there's 48,000 of them, right? Well, If that's per second, do the math yourself. That means every single one of those samples has to be sent within 1/3000th of a second. That's where we get our latency of about 300 microseconds for that packet to be delivered. Because if it's longer than that, then we're going to end up getting all the audio smashing into the back of us like a giant traffic jam, and then the audio is not being delivered in time. So that is where the speed requirement comes from. We need to be able to get those packets out at the speed of audio, right? Okay, well, you may remember this slide from the previous deck where we showed you that we are doing a general latency of 2.5 milliseconds across the network. How does that correspond with the thing we just said? Well, this is accommodating for the fact that the core will generally take about 2 milliseconds to do its processing. So we have about 300 microseconds to get from a device to the core, about 2 milliseconds for the core to manage it, and then about 300 more microseconds for it to get on its way. That's about a quarter of a millisecond, 2 milliseconds, about another quarter of a millisecond. That's the about 2.5 milliseconds we were talking about for the entire input to output latency that we were referring to. Now, this is heavily dependent on that packet getting across the switch in time, right? So what's happening in the middle of that is a switch. That's the network. That switch needs to be able to get that packet that's coming in and out again within that time frame. It's not about the size of the packets. These audio packets are not huge, but we need the speed for all the reasons we just said. That's why we need gigabit switches. This may seem silly, but this is one of the more common troubleshooting issues in the past, was that people just weren't using gigabit switches. You've got to use a gigabit switch for the speed. If you were using a 100 base T switch, that switch generally takes about 120 microseconds to get the data through the cable onto the switch. Switch still takes about 10 microseconds to make its decision on what to do with it, but then another 120 microseconds to go along the way. Well, that means that one single switch has used up almost the entirety of our buffer. So that's going to be a problem, right? If you have more than one switch at all, we're definitely beyond the latency of the entire system audio speaking wise now, right? So that's why we need gigabits. So if we swap that out for a gigabit switch, then the time on that network is essentially multiplied by 10, where it's now only 12 microseconds to take the data off of the cable, still about 10 microseconds for the switch itself to decide what to do and how to deliver it, and then another 12 microseconds for it to send it along its merry way. That's a total of 34 microseconds for one switch hop. That's very important. That means that you have room for multiple switch hops in your network, which is very, very likely. This is right here the reason why we need at least gigabit switches, right? Especially on the peripheral where the first device is sending it in, you need a gigabit switch. Further into the topology, you may realize you need even larger switches as you have cores talking to cores and higher levels of switches talking to each other. But again, at the very least, gigabit switches for that speed. We need the speed. Everything in this entire training, the whole point of all these videos, is we need to make sure that we are teaching you the protocols and the quality of service configurations and IGMP snooping. You're going to learn all about all this stuff so that these switches can properly get their information in and out in the speed that we need it so that the party can keep going. And I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hey, that was the same dinosaur. That was the same dinosaur, wasn't it? You're thinking these guys just went to some stock photography website and typed in guy with a dinosaur costume, and that's what we're going to do. We're just going to lazily throw them throughout the whole presentation, and we didn't really do the work on the jokes. So first of all, A, how dare you? How dare you? We are a professional company. B, that's exactly what we did. You are right, because that dinosaur is amazing. He can be anything. He could be a doctor. He could be an announcer. He could be your Uncle Terry after too many Mai Tais. Even if he worked really hard, he could be a horse. The only thing that dinosaur cannot do is mitigate the clock synchronization packet delivery between two devices across your local area network, which is why we use Precision Time Protocol v2 rather than dinosaurs to mitigate our clock synchronization. PTP v2 is a really, really important protocol to get right. Maybe the most important one. This is what defines the entire timing of all of the packets across your network. Let's dive in. So, precision time protocol, this really is the glue that keeps your networks functioning. We showed you this slide in the previous videos. James talked about how precision time protocol is sent out from the core, and then it is distributed to all of the devices that need to be timed appropriately, and that is true. But let's talk a little bit deeper about what that means. PTP is used very commonly in networks, especially in audio networks. Dante uses PTP v1, AES67 uses PTP v2 like we do. This is a networking standard that you will see a lot of times. And as I said, it is the most important thing to get right. It is the way that your system remains synchronized. And you may instinctively think that that means that all the devices just know what time it is. It's not quite that. It's more like all the devices have the same heartbeats, where you have one device on the network that is going to be called the grandmaster. And that grandmaster is responsible for keeping the timing of the system. And that device keeps on just sending out its timing packets at a quantifiable, reliable pace. And all the other devices expect to receive that and get onto the same pace. If you've seen Hudson Hawk, which of course you have, because it's a great movie, you're familiar with this because it's like when a bunch of bank robbers go to rob a bank and they set their watches, right? But rather than, it's not like they're setting it, oh, it's 12 o'clock right now. They're just setting it all to 12 o'clock because that way they all know that at 12:05, that's when the cops come and they got to get out by then. But if you're Hudson Hawk, you don't even use a watch. You just sing a song and you all sing the song at the same time, and that way you know by the chorus that's when the cops are coming. You should see it. You should see it if you haven't seen it. It's not that good, but you should see it. Anyways, for PTP v2, we require this same idea. We need to make sure that our clock packets are being sent out. Now, because they're being sent out, how do you think they are being delivered? Think about it. We have one device sending to multiple recipients. That means this is going to be UDP and multicast, right? Inherently, it's got to be. We can't wait for each receiving device to report back that it got the clock data. We're waiting for more clock data to go out. So we're sending this out multicast to every device that needs it via UDP. We're not waiting for confirmations. That does make sense. This is not a huge amount of traffic, right? We're sending about 100 packets per second, and there's about 100 bytes in each packet. That's not a lot. I know it sounds scary. It sounds like you're doing some quick math there, and there's a bunch of data there, but this is very, very common for this amount of traffic to be going out. Now, the latency for PTP between 2 points should not exceed 280 microseconds. And that number should feel really familiar. That's very similar to the latency we require for our core, right, to transmit data across the network. It's a really good idea to have the core also be the clock master for your PTP domain. The jitter of PTP v2 is considered how reliably those packets are being delivered. If for any reason we cannot get the packets to be delivered in the time that we need them to, then that jitter may exceed our threshold of plus or minus 30 microseconds. And now we've got information that tells us, hey, your clock's not being delivered properly. If the clock's not being delivered properly, that probably explains all the other issues on the network, right? Because if we can't get that right, then none of these devices are going to synchronize correctly. So this is, again, one of the most important things to get right, and it's worth talking about. So how do you decide who is the master? Well, if you go in Q-SYS Designer to the design properties, you will find this section here where it says PTP v2 domain. Now, every device that's in the same domain will be clocked together. And you may find that there's a good reason to have multiple devices on different domains. We'll talk about that in just a minute. By default, we're coming in at PTP domain 0, and that's pretty common. A lot of other devices in the world are mandatorily set to domain 0, so this puts us in the same domain as them. Whenever a device is connected to the network, and that's could be something very frequently. All of the devices that have PTP configured go through an election cycle where they use this best master clock algorithm. And they determine, hey, who should be in charge? It's like getting a new pope where you got to decide who's the most important person. We all got to get together. We all got to spend some time. And then the network sends out white smoke if it got a new master, and it sends out dark smoke if it doesn't have a new clock master, which is bad because that really just means your switch is on fire and you should replace it. What it does is every device looks at its priority number, and whoever has the lowest priority number 1 wins, unless there's a tie, in which case they all look at their second priority number, and whoever has the lowest second priority number wins, unless there's a tie, in which case they will look at various other things, including their MAC addresses if it resorts to the very last thing. Eventually there will be a winner selected that is the new clock master. That means that if you've got a device that is coming on and off the network a lot that has been set as the clock master, you're constantly swapping clock masters. We don't want that because that's going to result in some interruption of our packet delivery across the whole network. You want the clock master to be one of the most reliable devices on the network and make sure that no other devices will ever win that election when they get plugged in. Again, that's a strong argument for why your core should be set up as your clock grandmaster, and setting up your PTP priority numbers to be low enough that they will win is very important. Also in this area of the design properties, you have a couple of other things that you can configure. So you may need to manually turn PTP on some of your interfaces. If you do have Q-SYS devices on LAN A or LAN B, then PTP will turn on. But if you are communicating with some other devices, let's say on LAN B, maybe AES67 on that LAN, but there are no Q-SYS devices and you do still want to communicate with PTP, then you can activate manual force on for whichever LAN you need that to be active on. Also worth noting, usually this won't be an issue, but if you need to change the maximum transmittable unit size, you can do that here as well. So let's look at an example. Here is a corporate campus that has 5 buildings in it. And all the QLAN traffic is on an AV LAN, but only buildings 1 and 2 actually share any data between them. So right now, if all of these buildings were all on PTP v2 domain 0, they're all going to share that same clock leader, which is another term you could use, by the way, for whoever is in charge of the clock packet. So if the leader is on building E and there is a bad fiber connection somewhere between all of these buildings, and we see that building E is coming on and off the network all the time, that means that all of these buildings are going to see their elections constantly reinitializing as that other device comes on and offline. And we don't need to do that, right? Because we're not sharing any QLAN traffic from building E to these other buildings, there's no reason for us to put them all on the same clock. Same thing like if you're going to be working on one of these buildings, one of them is going down for maintenance, there's no reason to disrupt the service to the other buildings and have something go wrong when you could avoid it. So that's a good reason to segregate these and put them all on their own individual domains. Buildings 1 and 2, yeah, those are sharing audio with each other. They will still be on the same domain. But put building C on its own domain, put building D on its own domain, put building E on its own domain. Keeping these isolated protects your system, because what if you're adding equipment into one of these buildings that has not been configured yet properly, right? What if the leader goes down in building E and building 2 now gets interrupted? Any change in those devices in another domain, you don't want it to affect what's happening in your domain, right? Anything you can do to make sure that the devices within their domain are protected from changes elsewhere in the campus is a good idea. So putting each building that does not talk to each other on its own domain is basically a good way to go. We recommend it. All right, we've gone through a lot. Let's take a break right here. Take a quick break. We'll see you when you're ready.